So welcome guys to a whole new series. This series is going to be about malware analysis. The first episode of this series is going to cover how to set up a secure sandbox environment for analyzing your malware samples. So this series is going to cover the use of VirtualBox hypervisor. You can also use VMware. Then we're going to set up two VMs. So the first VM is called FlareVM. Then the second virtual machine is called Remnux virtual machine. So in order to install VirtualBox, we are going to navigate to the official website, which is virtualbox.org, then download depending on the host system that you're using. So in my case, I've already downloaded the Windows host version. Then we're going to need Python because Python is also needed for setting up a VirtualBox in terms of setting up the SDKs. So we'll also download Python from the original website, that is python.org. Once you have it downloaded, you can proceed to install it and also make sure that it's already set to the path. So in my case, I've already installed Python, but if you haven't installed Python, you can do it from their official website. So once you're done installing Python, we're going to proceed with installing a VirtualBox. So just double click on the executable and click yes. I think I clicked twice, but you can just proceed. Click next, then accept the terms of the license agreement. Click next. The VirtualBox installer will turn off the network interfaces, so you'll be briefly disconnected from the internet before you can reconnect again. So just proceed. Click yes, then proceed and install VirtualBox. So this first series of the video will cover setting up FlareVM. Then in the next video, I'll show you guys how to set up Remnux VM, and we'll also set up the network simulator modules so that both VMs can communicate over the network. So we're just going to wait for VirtualBox to complete the setup and install. So while the setup installs, we're going to navigate to the official FlareVM GitHub repository. Then we're going to follow their requirements. So for the requirements, we need a Windows version that is Windows 10 or greater than Windows 10. The PowerShell version should be 5 or greater than 5. Disk capacity 60 GB. Internet connection. Then we're going to disable malware and Windows Update. So we'll begin by downloading the Windows ISO image file from the official Microsoft website over here. So click download now. it will automatically download the media creation tool that we'll use to create our Windows ISO image file. So we'll wait for the setup to initiate. Just give it a few minutes. So the first option will be to accept the license terms and agreement, which we'll accept. Then we'll select the second option to create an installation media, because we want an ISO image file that we'll use to create our virtual machine. So select the second option, click next. We'll uncheck this option so that it uses the default recommended options that come pre-installed with this Windows ISO image. So if you want it to adopt some of the settings that you have on your current system, then you can check this option. But in our case, we want the default options. So we'll uncheck this option. Click next. Then we'll select the second option so that we can have the ISO image file, and click next. Then we'll specify where we'll store our Windows ISO image. So in my case, I have a folder called image files on the desktop, and the file name is Windows. Then the type is an ISO image. So click on save, and we'll give it some time to initiate the download process and set up the ISO image. So this will take a couple of minutes. So we'll give it some time to verify the installation ISO image. So we'll give it some time to complete. So the ISO image file is successfully created on our image files desktop folder. And just to confirm, if we hover to our image files, we'll see that a new ISO image called Windows has been created on this specific folder. So we'll finish. Then the next step will be setting up our virtual machine on VirtualBox. Remember, when we started, we said that there are different hypervisors that you can use on setting up these virtual machines. So in our case, we chose Oracle VirtualBox. And to create a new machine, we'll go to Machine, then click on New. We'll give our machine a name. So in this case, we can call it Windows 10. Then for the folder where we're going to store our own virtual machine, we can specify a different folder depending on your storage size. So in my case, I'm going to store it on a virtual machines folder in a separate partition. Then we're going to select the specific ISO image that we created just right now, and click on Open. Then we're going to check these options so that we can proceed to do a manual installation and specify the specific partitions that we want our Windows operating system to be installed on. So in this case, we're going to check this option so that we can proceed with the manual installation. Then for the hardware section, remember from the Flare documentation, we need a base memory of around 2 GB and a disk capacity of 60 GB. So we'll adjust the same configurations on our hardware. So we can give it a base memory of greater than 2 GB. So I'll give it 16 GB. Then for the number of processors, we can give it 5 core processors. I think 5 should be enough. Then for the hard disk, we can give it a storage size of 100 GB should be enough. So 100 GB. Just to check through again, the name of our virtual machine is called Windows 10. The folder where we're going to store our virtual machine, we've already specified it. We've selected the ISO image that we've created right now using the media creation tool. We've set the requirements for the base memory to around 16 GB and 5 core processors and a storage size of 101 GB. So click finish. Then before we start our virtual machine, we'll modify one configuration on our systems on acceleration. Then we use a Hyper-V interface and click OK. Then we'll start our virtual machine. We just give our virtual machine some time to power on, and we'll proceed with the installation process of Windows operating system. So for the initial configuration, we'll leave everything to default settings. If you want to change your languages, you can change from here. But in my case, I'm going to leave everything to the default. Click next, then click install now. So we don't have a product key. So if you don't have a product key, you can select this option. I don't have a product key. Then depending on the operating system that you want, you can choose any that suits you. So in my case, I'll proceed with Windows 10 Pro. Click next. Then we're going to read through the license terms, then check this option to accept. Click next. Then in our scenario, we're going to proceed with the custom install so that we can specify the specific partitions that you want to install your Windows operating system on. So in this case, if you want to create other separate partitions, you can proceed with the second option. So in my case, I'll proceed the second option. Then as you can see over here, we have the total storage size for the storage that we created when setting up this VM. So remember it was 101 GB. So we'll select it, click next. Then we'll give it some time, complete the setup, and install all the required files for the Windows operating system. So give it some time to complete. Once it's done installing the necessary files, we're going to click Restart Now to automatically restart the system and complete the installation process. Press any key, then Windows will boot. You're going to go to Devices, then unmount both ISO images. So close this, then power off the machine. Settings. Then we'll unmount this specific ISO image. Click OK. Then we'll start it again. So remember, we've unmounted the ISO image so that we don't restart the installation process again. So that should solve the reason why it was initially starting the setup process again. So right now, everything is booting up, and we just give it some time to configure the final settings. Then we'll proceed. So the region, we can leave it to default settings, that is United States. Default settings for the keyboard layout, we'll skip this step. So we're going to check the first option and proceed with the first option to set it up for personal use. Click next. Then we proceed using an offline account. But in any case, if you want to sign in with your Microsoft account, then you can sign in from here. But in our case, we're going to proceed with an offline account. Then select the limited experience option. So give it a name. So for the username, remember the username is supposed to be without any special characters and no spaces. So when we're creating a username, supposed to factor this as well. Click next. Set a password. And for the security questions, we can use any. So in this case, I'll set up 3 questions. You can use any placeholder, so it doesn't matter what you're going to choose. Select not now. Then we're going to turn some of the options over here, like find my device. It depends on the amount of privacy that you need when using this operating system. So in this case, I unchecked the ones that are shown over there. Then we'll skip this step. Then select not now and give it some time for Windows to boot up. So Windows loads and we'll close this dialog box and we will try and maximize and see the display. So as you can see over here, if you try and maximize, the display is still in a small aspect ratio. So in order to adjust that, we're going to install VirtualBox guest additions. In order to do that, select devices, then click insert guest additions CD image. I'll try and mount it again. So we'll fix this problem. Let's go and mount it as an optical drive. So I'll power this machine off. So we've mounted VirtualBox guest additions as an optical drive. Then we'll power on the machine. So the system is already booted. We'll log in with our password. So right now we should have VirtualBox guest additions ISO image mounted to our PC. So just to confirm, go to this PC, and as you can see on the right side, we have VirtualBox guest additions mounted. So right click on it and click on open. Then we're going to select VirtualBox Windows Additions and then run it as administrator. Then we'll have to reboot our machine so that all the settings can be implemented. So we'll give it some time to restart. Then we'll log in with our password. Then once again, we'll try and maximize the screen. Let's try it again. And as you can see, we have the display in the proper aspect ratio and we can view it in full screen. Right now we have Windows 10 virtual machine properly installed in VirtualBox. We're using it as a hypervisor. And the next step is to proceed and follow the documentation on FlareVM installation. So we've already satisfied the first step. We have Windows running as a virtual machine. So the next step is to check the PowerShell version. And in order to do that, we go to PowerShell. Then we'll run this command. PS version table. So as you can see, we're running PowerShell version 5.1, which is part of a requirement. For the disk capacity and the base memory size, we've already adjusted that when we were initially configuring the VirtualBox virtual machine. We've already set up the username, so it doesn't have any spaces or any special characters within it. Then the next step is to disable tamper protection and any malware solutions, anti-malware solutions that are within your system. So typically in Windows systems, there are a lot of options that you can do in terms of configuring Windows security. So the first option is to go to Windows security. Then we'll disable most of the security settings from there. So the first option, disable real-time protection, cloud delivery protection, sample submission. Basically, all the security settings that are within your Windows operating system are supposed to be disabled so that FlareVM can run smoothly during the installation process. So you also disable firewalls, that is on the domain network, private network, and public network. So do the same on private network. and the public network as well. Then for the other security settings, let's check device security, core isolation details, app and browser control. We're going to turn these off as well. Exploit protection settings. This one should be good. So this is the first method of disabling most of the security features within your Windows operating system. But this method has a limitation because every time you try and reboot your system, some of the security configurations will automatically turn on. So there is another option, there's another method to disable some of these security settings permanently, regardless of when the system has rebooted. So most of the settings will be in place. So in order to do that, we'll move on to modify our group policies settings. And to do that, type gpedit.msc. Then let me maximize this. And before we do that, it's a rule of thumb to always take a snapshot of your original state of Windows machine. In the event you tamper with your system during the Flare installation process, then you can always revert to this specific snapshot. So we call it fresh. Then the description is clean, install Windows operating system OS. Click OK. Give it some time to take the snapshot. So the first option is to disable Windows updates. And to do that, go to GPO policies, then administrative templates, Windows components, and look for Windows updates. This one over here. So the specific policy that we're trying to modify is the configure automatic updates. So in order to modify this specific policy, right click on it, select edit. And in our case, we want to disable any automatic updates and click apply and click OK. Then for the second option, we're supposed to disable Windows Defender. So over to Microsoft Defender Antivirus, we'll start with real-time protection, turn off real-time protection, modify this policy. And in this case, we want to enable this policy so that turn off real-time protection is set to permanently be implemented as off in this system. And even if you try and reboot your system, then real-time protection will still be off. So select apply, click OK. Then just to confirm, if you go back to Windows security, in our case, as you can see, if you manage settings, this settings is managed by your administrator. So in this case, it's permanently off. And yeah, the rest of the security settings are also off. Tamper protection is off. So if we go back to our Flare documentation, so this is Edge, just confirm and continue. Continue without Google data. Start browsing. So go back to our original Flare documentation. And we are going to go through all the requirements and make sure that we've satisfied all the requirements before we proceed to install Flare on our virtual machine. So for the first requirement, if we check closely, We already have Windows 10. We've checked that we have our PowerShell version, which is 5.1. This capacity and base memory is already okay. Username is okay. Internet connection. We've disabled tamper protection and any anti-malware solution, in this case Windows Defender, and we've also disabled Windows updates from the group policies. So now we'll proceed to install Flare virtual machine from PowerShell. And to install Flare virtual machine from PowerShell, we have to launch it as an administrator. So go to PowerShell and we launch it as an administrator. So first things first, the first command, copy the first command. So for this command, it will install a PowerShell script called install.ps1 from the GitHub repository. And the specific folder path that this specific PowerShell script will be stored is on the desktop folder. So we'll paste that command, hit enter. Then we'll navigate to our desktop. Then we'll list our current directory, and as you can see, the install.ps1 script is over here. So the second option is to unlock that specific script we're supposed to run. So that is successful. Then we're going to set the execution policy to unrestricted. Then for the final step, we're going to run the installer script. Before we do that, we're just going to save this current state. Let me just save this machine so that when we revert back to a snapshot, we can always go back to this current saved state. So we go back to our VirtualBox manager, then we'll start it again. Give it some time to restore the virtual machine to the saved state that we had before. So the final step will be running the installation script. So once we run the installation script, it will check all the parameters and requirements that it had initially. So in this case, checking the PowerShell version, checking if it's running as an administrator. In our case, we've already launched PowerShell as an admin. Then execution policies, we've set it to unrestricted. Windows version is Windows 10. Tamper protection is disabled. So select Y. Just type Y on your keyboard, hit enter. We already have a VM snapshot, so Flare automatically reminds you to take a snapshot of the machine in the event that the machine is tampered with during the installation process. So we already have a snapshot created, so hit yes. Then for the final step, we insert our password and hit enter. So this process typically takes a long time. So we'll just leave it at that. Then we'll be back once the setup process is complete. So right now, Flare is installing on our current Windows operating system. You just leave it and make sure that it's connected to the internet so that it can install and download all the necessary packages that are needed. So it's going to give us an option to select the environment variables. Just select continue. Then to give you a list of all the packages that will be installed on FlareVM. So if you want to install any extra packages, you can always check the packages over here. But in our case, we have the default selection for all the packages that come installed with Flare. And also in other cases, if you have an external package that you want to come with your Flare virtual machine, then you can search it over here. Then I find the package and add it as part of the installation. So in our case, most of the packages will be left to the default selections. Then we'll click install. So we'll give Flare some time to install. Then we'll be back to check if it's complete. So there we have it. FlareVM is successfully installed, and we have a log.txt file that contains details of all the packages that were installed, any errors that had occurred, details about all the modified registry keys. So if you want to check anything, you can always check from here. Then we'll proceed to press enter to exit. So before we do anything, we're supposed to create a snapshot of this virtual machine. So we can always revert back to this specific snapshot when we start analyzing our malware samples. So to create a snapshot, go to machine, then take a snapshot. And we'll name it as Flare Malware Forensics. Then for the description, we can give it as complete install of FlareVM. So this one is the clean version, nothing modified. And click OK to take the snapshot. So we've successfully taken a snapshot of the virtual machine with the clean version of Flare virtual machine. So if you want to check some of the tools that come with Flare virtual machine, we have a couple of tools over here, and these will be some of the tools that we'll use for the next labs and for the analysis of the rest of the malware samples. So this completes the first lab and the first episode of this series, and we've successfully set up Flare virtual machine, which is the first virtual machine in our malware analysis lab. The next video will drop soon, and it will cover the next part where we're supposed to configure Remnux VM and create a host network interface that will connect to our Flare virtual machine. So that's all for this episode, guys. If you have any suggestions, drop a comment, like, share, and subscribe, and see you on the next one.